Hey there, everyone. Mychal, Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology with yet another question and answer segment where practicing astrologers bring me their questions and I provide them answers based on my astrological practice.
I recently watched a blind chart reading that you did when the person had Venus in a Mars ruled sign, and you said that that makes a Marsy Venus, and you said that makes for kind of a sexy person. So, do you generalize that to anytime Venus is in a Mars ruled sign? And what about if Mars is in a Venus ruled sign?
Okay, so every time I give a blind chart reading, there are certain things within the blind chart reading that I hope people don't really latch onto. And that is definitely one of the things that I would have hoped that people had just brushed over to the side. But the question is my understanding of what it means for somebody to have a planet within a particular sign of the zodiac. Now, as everybody knows, I'm not a signs of the zodiac type astrologer at all. It's literally the anathema of me, and I really don't speak about the signs of the zodiac as a standalone concept. The reason why I tend not to centralize the signs of the zodiac is because when we do that, it quickly causes us to go into this false categorization of everyone and everything in the world into 12 discrete segments. I think that this has been the number one scientific qualm with astrology, that very often when people put themselves in a position to prove astrology, they do so by talking about the signs of the zodiac, and invariably they often do so by talking about the sun, moon, and rising of a person and the specific signs of the zodiac that those factors tend to be in. But as we've seen, and there are countless videos and interviews where astrologers, well meaning astrologers, have positioned themselves to defend astrology against a panel of critics, and they've done that by attempting to give a blind chart reading. But when they give the blind chart reading, they start by talking about the person's sun sign, their moon sign, and their rising sign. And it always fails. I don't think that there is one demonstration of astrology online where someone has demonstrated astrology using that sort of astrological technology, and by technology I mean that sort of astrological methodology, and it's actually worked. And the reason for that is because very often when we lean very heavily on the signs of the zodiac as a descriptive model, where one only really speaking about the personality of a person, which, as we know, is a very subjective thing. And while we all have our clear psychological orientation to life, at any given point in time, when we talk about the signs of the zodiac as a primary means of describing somebody's primary orientation to life, we really exclude a lot of other things that can be going on within their chart that directly augment how they manifest that specific quality within this lifetime. So this is a very good example. This particular blind chart reading where this lady had the Sun and Venus and Mercury all at 15 degrees of Aries. And so I started to go down a particular path in describing those things in a conjunction with Mars. And the reason for that is because I find it far more useful to talk about a planet in a sign as if that planet were also conjunct the domicile ruler of that sign than to speak about that planet in the sign as if that sign were a concept all by itself. Now, this narrative of signs being a concept all by themselves is a very recent thing within our astrology, and I dare say it's as recent as the last 100, if not probably the last 80 years of our astrological history, where the signs of the zodiac have taken on this robust life of their own, separate and completely independent of the planets that are either in those signs or than the planets that are the domicile rulers of those signs. And truthfully, I can see why that could happen because the signs of the zodiac do lend themselves to this broadened mythological understanding. But at the same time, that overemphasizing of the signs of the zodiac is a thing that really diminishes how far we can go in terms of our actual ability to concretely describe the events that have occurred within a person's life. Because inevitably, when we start talking about the signs of the zodiac, we are only really going to be focusing on the things that make that person psychologically unique, or the things that makes that person psychologically show up within the world at large. So instead of doing that, or instead of really centralizing the sign, I try to get my students to go back to thinking about the planet that actually rules that sign. So if we have Venus in Aries, I tend to think about that as a Venus-Mars contact. Similarly, if we have Venus in Scorpio, I tend to think about that as a Venus-Mars contact. So whenever we have a planet that is within the sign or the domicile of any other planet, traditionally speaking, we have a means of thinking about that as if that planet were actually in a conjunction with the domicile ruler of that sign. And this is something that we see evidence of as far back as the 13th century in traditional astrology, in the writings of Guido Bonatti, where he speaks about what it means for Mars to be in any of the domiciles of Saturn, or what it means for Venus to be in any of the domiciles of Mars, or what it means for the Sun to be in the domicile of the Moon. So we have this understanding from a traditional perspective more of what it means for a planet to be in the home of another planet, as opposed to what it means for a planet to just be in a sign. Because in traditional astrology, the signs of the zodiac themselves are not necessarily the be-all or the end-all. And Jean-Baptiste Morand, who was a French astrologer in the 17th century, said that if Mars were no longer to exist, then the signs that we consider to be the homes of Mars, in other words, Aries and Scorpio, they would cease to hold any meaning whatsoever, because the life of the signs of the zodiac is completely dependent on the planets that rule those signs. And independent of those planets that rule those signs, then those signs resume just being stretches or expanses of space that don't actually have a qualitative factor, because the sign's ability to qualify anything specifically comes from the fact that those signs are governed by planets. So I always like to take people back to this understanding of the planets. Now, when it comes to speaking about planets in signs, and this example was my blind chart reading where the lady had Venus in Aries, one of the biggest mistakes that astrologers tend to always make, and they could be traditional astrologers, modern astrologers, or anything in between, but one of the hugest mistakes I always see astrologers make is the mistake of reading. Oh, okay. We're not trying to get canceled in 2023, but it's the mistake of seeing someone with an Aries influence, Aries emphasis in their chart, such as, say, Sun in Aries. We see somebody with the Sun in Aries, and we build a whole narrative around what it means for that person to have their Sun in Aries. We do the same thing for people who have their Sun in Leo. When it comes to Aries and when it comes to Leo, no matter how well trained that astrologer is, there are certain defaults that I don't even know where these defaults come from. Maybe because it's the sun, and maybe because the sun is the king of the solar system, or whatever. But there are certain defaults that we have as astrologers that whenever we see the sun in Leo, we feel as if we already know what's going on within that person's narrative. Whenever we see somebody with the sun in Aries, we feel as if we already know what's going on within that person's narrative. And whenever I've seen a world famous top quality astrologer try to do a blind chart reading and get it wrong, it's either been when the person who they were giving that blind chart reading to had the sun in Aries or the sun in Leo. And I don't know why that is. I don't know why seeing the sun in Aries and seeing the sun in Leo causes us as a community to forget everything else that we believe in as astrologers. because we want to start talking about the proud Leonian person who is boisterous and who has the hearty laughter, and the person who takes care of everybody around them, and the person who goes into the room and tends to exaggerate. We want to build that narrative when we see somebody with the sun in Leo. Similarly, when we see somebody with the sun in Aries, we want to go down this very fiery, robust, action-oriented, completely self-focused, completely driven, completely passionate pathway, because there's just something within our larger astrological understanding that causes those things to be the first things that blurt out of our mouths whenever we see them. However, it takes a lot for somebody to be a textbook Aries, and it takes a lot for somebody to be a textbook Leo. Now, I would never talk like this because there's no version of the universe in which anyone has ever heard me talk about what it takes to be a particular sign of the zodiac, because I just don't practice astrology in that way, and I don't practice astrology in a way where I centralize the definitions of the signs themselves. However, when it comes to Aries and Leo, I feel, especially within the context of teaching natal astrology, I feel like I always need to pause and really fill people in on this great astrological secret, because I find that astrologers, and it doesn't matter, they could be younger astrologers, they could be the seasoned, most best astrologers in the world, but I find that as astrologers, we tend to have these defaults surrounding the sun in either of these two signs that aren't helpful. And the reason why these defaults aren't helpful is because if a person has their sun in Aries, as was the case with the example in my most recent blind chart reading, and that sun in Aries has even the slightest, tiniest square from Saturn, it destroys the entire understanding of what it means for that person to be a quote-unquote stereotypical Aries. If a person has the sun in Aries and has the slightest, tiniest sneeze of a semi-square from Neptune, it destroys the entire narrative of what it means for that person to be a textbook Aries. And the same is also true when we think about the sun in Leo. Sun in Leo, but that person has that sun receiving the conjunction, the semi-square, the square, the sesquiquadrate, the opposition, the quincunx from either Saturn or Neptune, and our entire understanding of what it means for that person to be a textbook Leo completely gets thrown out of the window. So, I think the point of saying all of this is that if we're going to read a person's chart and we see that person has the sun in either Aries or Leo within their birth chart, we really have to make sure that everything else within that chart is also in harmony with that Aries narrative or that Leo narrative, because the tiniest, smallest drop of a sneeze from Saturn or Neptune completely destroys and alters our entire narrative of the proud and robust lion or of the action-oriented angry ram. So that's something that's necessary for us to know in general. Now, stepping back a bit, this whole notion of the sun in a particular sign of the zodiac is also a speculative one. And I recently heard an interview with someone who was talking about the big three. And as you all know, I made a video a while ago that says your big three isn't even a big deal in traditional astrology, because in traditional astrology, your big three really isn't a big deal. We don't have a traditional astrological model of reading a person's chart through their sun, moon, and rising. That does not exist anywhere within the entire landscape of our astrological kingdom. Do we have a classical model of reading a person's birth chart based on their big three of sun, moon, and rising sign? Now, we do have classical versions of astrology that do centralize the sun and the moon for very good reason. And a part of this is because if a person is having a daytime chart with the sun above the horizon, then that means that the sun within that chart is going to be their insect luminary. Insect, not a bug, but in dash sect, meaning that the sun is going to a very large degree, demarcate the three periods of that person's life and the level of health and vitality and joy they might find in any one of those three periods. Similarly, if a person is having a nocturnal chart with the sun below the horizon, then the moon is going to be their insect luminary, and then the moon is going to be used to demarcate the three periods of that person's joy or the three periods of that person's health, vitality, well-being, and happiness within the three stages of their life, the beginning, the middle, and the end. We also have a version of this within medical astrology, where the sun is considered to be the high leg or the giver of life in the chart of a man, and the moon is considered to be the high leg or the giver of life within the chart of a woman. So from a medical astrology perspective, if we have a man's chart, we would use the sun as a more specific index of his health and vitality within this lifetime, and within the woman's chart, we would use the moon as a more specific index of her health and of her vitality within this lifetime. So within traditional astrology, we do have models of using the sun sign, not even the sun sign. Notice, I'm not talking about the sign, I'm talking about the planet. So we do have models of using the sun and the moon as being very important indices. We do have versions of using the sun and the moon as being very important indices of a person's life and their vitality and their well-being and their immunity and their ability to ward off calamity and disease. We do use those two planets for that reason, but we don't use them from this very reductionistic modern perspective of interpreting the sun as being your ego and interpreting the moon as being your emotions. That just doesn't happen anywhere within traditional astrology, and if anyone can prove me wrong on that specific point, I would be very shocked. So anyway, so that's the sun and the moon specifically, and then the rising sign has been used more as a point of speaking about a person's personality than necessarily the sun and the moon. And as we go into the 17th century, we do see the sun and the moon coming into play, but we also see the sun and the moon coming into play more specifically based on the aspects they're receiving and not just based on the signs of the zodiac that they tend to be inhabiting. Now, coming back to the initial question that was asked regarding Venus within the domiciles of Mars, a Venus within the domiciles of Mars does create a more Martian Venus. So when we think about Venus and Mars in any sort of direct combination, we think about this fundamental animal magnetism that causes people to be attracted to people. So there is an attractiveness, there is a quote-unquote sex appeal. There is a libidinous energy when we find Venus and Mars together within any sort of combination, because that's just what those two planets do. Venus and Mars is a combination of creativity, but it's also a combination of creativity. I don't even know if that's a word. I know that procreation is a word, but I'm not sure that procreativity is a word. But anyway, Venus and Mars is a combination of creativity as well as of procreation. So there is a very strong sexual impulse that we find when we have Venus within the domiciles of Mars, period. There's a lot that can be said about that, truly, but okay, so when Venus is in the domicile of Mars, which is Aries, that does tend to create a more fiery Venus. Whereas when Venus is within the domicile of Mars, that is Scorpio, that fire becomes more internalized. And the reason for that is because fire as an element tends to be more expressive. So the masculine signs, which are the fire and the air signs, tend to express that more externally, whereas the feminine signs, which are the water and the earth signs, tend to internalize those impulses. So we still get the same sort of creative impetus from that Venus, but we get that creative impetus expressing itself in a very different way. Whereas the Venus in Aries would express itself in a more externalized, creative way. The Venus in Scorpio could do that in a more internal or a more hidden or a more discreet manner, basically. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because truthfully, we can't really judge a planet just based on the sign that it's in because of Venus and Mars, once again, picking up the square from Saturn or the square from Neptune, or that Venus and Mars being in the conjunction with the South Node completely diminishes our understanding of what it means for that Venus to be in the domicile of Mars. Conversely, having Mars within the domiciles of Venus does not yield the same thing. And it's now apparent to me why the person who asked this question because I think the person who asked this question has her Mars in one of the domiciles of Venus. So, having Mars in the domicile of Venus doesn't necessarily yield the same thing. And the reason for that is because Mars in Taurus and Mars in Libra both seem to manifest in a way that tends to subdue the Mars. And so this goes to a larger point that I made in my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology. It's important for us to understand the planets based on their own terms so that we can understand how those planets will manifest within any given sign of the zodiac we find them in. So one might argue that Venus in Aries and Venus in Scorpio, from a qualitative perspective, can figure out how to navigate those circumstances and still be Venusian, whereas Mars in Taurus and Mars in Libra can't. And when we have Mars in Taurus, we oftentimes can feel as if there is a blockage or a stifling of one's ability to get up and go, or of one's ability to take the world by the horns, or of one's ability to really quickly move into action or quickly adapt to changing circumstances around them. Because Taurus is the most fixed sign of the zodiac, because Taurus isn't just a fixed sign, but it's also an earth sign. So Taurus as fixed earth is really the astrological equivalent of concrete. So when we put Mars within the domicile of Venus, that is Taurus, that Mars doesn't really know how to function because Taurus doesn't give Mars any of the leeway necessary to move in a very robust way or in a very robust manner. So it can feel as if there's a major blockage on one's vitality or of vitality in general when we have the Mars in Taurus. I don't want for us to really isolate this specifically within the medical astrology context, because within the medical astrology context, we need to look at many other corroborating factors within a person's chart before we can say anything once. However, from a universal perspective, that's how Mars in Taurus tends to operate. Mars possibly does better in Libra than it does in Taurus. And the reason for that is because whereas Taurus is a fixed earth sign, Libra is a cardinal, also known as movable, air sign. Mars likes to move it. And just in the same way as air is volatile, Mars is also volatile. So Libra gives Mars a greater amount of mobility or a greater amount of motility than Taurus does, because Taurus is the very opposite of movability and is the very opposite of an element that can actually move by itself. In order for us to move Earth, we have to exert an external pressure on Earth, whereas air just tends to always be in a constant state of flux. So Mars in Libra, even though it's really not the best place in the world for Mars to be, Mars in Libra does still seem to manifest in a way that is more in conformity with the nature of Mars than Mars in Taurus does. So, that is kind of all I have to say about this. I hope I answered that in a comprehensive way. And I think the larger question was, does Mars in the domiciles of Venus give Mars the same sort of creativity that we find when we have Venus in the domiciles of Mars? And I would say that Mars in Taurus may not necessarily do that, but Mars in Libra possibly has more ability to do that. And I think one of the things that people often find when they do have Mars in Libra, I don't want for this to be the soundbite that people leave with, because I'm not assigned to the zodiac sort of person, and whatever, that's just how I feel about life. But one of the things that we do oftentimes find when somebody is having Mars in Libra is that that person And once again, broad generalization, because in order for us to say anything at all, we need to see the chart of that person in general. But that person can oftentimes find themselves in more of the Venusian role of bouncing back and forward. They use their Martian fire to bounce back and forward between the opinions of people, which is very great for someone who is working in a mediating capacity, where they oftentimes find themselves having to mediate the conflicts that occur between people. Because whenever we have Mars in Libra, one, Mars has movability because Libra is a movable sign. But Mars also has this desire to understand because Libra is an air sign, and Mars also is enforced upon by Venus to try to find a midpoint, or to try to find some sense of stillness or some sense of peaceful exchange between people. And so very often the positive way that Mars in Libra can manifest is by that person knowing how to volley themselves back and forth between the opinions of people, which is why we oftentimes can find a person working in HR or public relations or even the legal industry having their Mars in Libra, because they have the passion and they have the desire and they have the willpower to do the back and forward necessary to go between people until they actually find a still point of truth that relatively allows everybody to feel happy at the end of the day. So, I have done the thing I said I would never do. I've given a definition for what it means for a planet to be in a sign purely based on the signiness of that sign, and I hope that I've made somebody happy. Hey there, everyone. I just want to say thank you all so much for the love and support that you've shown me in the months after the publication of my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology. If you have loved reading MTA and if it has deepened your astrological relationship and practice in any way whatsoever, then please leave a 5-star review for us over on Amazon.com. As a self-published author, this would mean the world to me, because the more 5-star high-quality reviews we get, the more Amazon promotes the book to a wider audience so that more and more people can experience the magic that is mastering traditional astrology. Thank you so much for your continued love and support, and thank you so much for your dedication to this extraordinary field of astrology.